this year we're celebrating 20 years of transfrontier conservation in Southern Africa. In terms of the foundation or the legal foundation for establishing transfrontier conservation areas is the SADC Protocol on Wildlife Conservation and Law Enforcement, which calls for member states to promote conservation of shared wildlife resources through the establishment of TFCAs. Therefore, all international agreements that establish transfrontier conservation areas are based on this protocol, but also realizing that transfrontier conservation areas are cross-cutting, the agreements are also informed by other protocols in SADC, for example, the protocol on development of tourism, the protocol on shared watercourses, the protocol on forestry, and other protocols in SADC, as well as the multilateral environmental agreements that have relevance to the conservation of biodiversity in our areas. As I said, from 1999 on 2000, when we started having one transfrontier conservation areas, we've made significant strides in having a number of TFCAs. But it was realized that we need some kind of coordination because the TFCAs were coming, but there was no framework that guides the implementation or development of TFCAs. So member states, SADC member states, directed SADC Secretariat to develop a SADC tourism program that can provide and guide and coordinate the TFCA development process in the region, as well as support mobilization of technical and financial resources. So this strategy was developed and it was approved in 2013 and is currently being implemented. It has 7 components, which we are going to hear about them in the upcoming presentations, but these components range from issues around policy and advocacy, issues of capacity building, issues of knowledge management and sharing of information, issues of development of TFCAs into marketable tourism products in the region. My colleagues will provide more information on those areas. But I'd like also to say that the SADC TFCA program is aligned to our SADC Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, which guides the implementation of SADC Treaty. And SADC Treaty itself has identified sustainable development as well as conservation and transboundary natural resource management as a priority for SADC. So the SADC TFCA program is one of the key strategies that support implementation of the treaty, the SADC Regional Indicative Strategic Development Plan, as well as the Regional Agriculture Investment Plan. Under the TFCA program, we have a component that calls for establishment of data and knowledge management system. This is component 4 of the SADC TFCA program, and under which the SADC TFCA network was established in 2013. This network is an organized forum of TFCA practitioners, which include government, civil society, private sector, and academia, who came together to share information and knowledge about transfrontier conservation areas, facilitate learning, also to identify issues of collaboration and innovation that can help the implementation of transfrontier conservation areas. Since this network was established in 2013, it has grown from strength to strength. Currently, there are about 300 to 350 members of the TFCA network, and they've been active in terms of implementing the TFCA program. And we're going to hear more about the TFCA network as we move along. So TFCA network will be hosting a series of webinars, as I mentioned earlier, for a period of 10 weeks, starting from today, to celebrate 20 years of transfrontier conservation in SADC region. These webinars will include presentations of work that has been done in TFCAs, highlighting successes, challenges, lessons learned, as well as sharing of ideas, how we can move about in developing and implementing transfrontier conservation areas, also to help and build resilient and adaptable socio-ecological system, especially in a post-pandemic world. We all know that we are battling with COVID-19, so we'd like to see how different aspects of ecosystems can help us in building our resilience in the post-COVID-19 world, for example. So with those few remarks, I'd like to introduce you to my list of people that are going to make presentation to you. I have 3 experts, as I said earlier. I have Seth Mapalala from the Kingdom of Eswatini. I have Tawanda Gotosa from SADC Secretariat, and also Dr. Bartolomeu Sotu from Mozambique, who are going to make different, give you presentations on different aspects of TFCAs. To begin with, I'm going to invite my colleague Tawanda Gotosa. Tawanda Gotosa is going to give a presentation on the SADC TFCA program and post-2020 vision. Tawanda works for SADC Secretariat. He's a TFCA advisor. He is supporting and coordinating the implementation of Transfrontier Conservation Areas program. Prior to joining the Secretariat, Tawanda Gotrosa was working for Zimbabwe Parks, Zimpax, as a principal warden. So I'm going to invite Tawanda to give a presentation on the SADC TFCA program and post-2020 vision. Tawanda, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Madam, and thank you for the presentation. Good afternoon once again, everybody. My name is Tawanda, and I'm the technical advisor, Transfrontier Conservation Areas in SADC region, and I work with Deborah. I'll quickly talk about the TFCA program, as he indicated, and also look at some of the current focus that we have as a program, and then going forward beyond 2020, what exactly are we going to touch on? Can I have the next slide, please? So by way of background, I think, as you might appreciate from the initial presentation, the program itself is actually born out of the SADC policies, which are core, and the policies are also informed by some of the global events and challenges that we face, especially with regards to biodiversity conservation. There are so many conventions, there are so many trends globally. But I think as a region, one of the major challenges we've been facing over the last 2 decades or so, there's been so much pressure on the resource, particularly with regards to illegal offtake, also with regards to conflict in land use, participation of local communities, and so forth. So because of that, and some of the developments that are taking place around us, we had to come up with this SADC TFCA program that was approved in 2013 by the SADC member states. So essentially, the program addresses the issues of connectivity between the different conservation islands that are within the region, but and also to look at a much broader landscape level. As you might appreciate from that map, it presents the whole SADC region, and the TFCAs are marked in the reddish color there. And there is the important aspect of TFCAs is trying to connect the different isolated protected areas and conservation areas at a much broader landscape level, so that we maximize on ecosystem services. We also maximize on participation of different stakeholders from the definition of the TFCAs, as you appreciate later on in the presentation. But I think of most importance is the whole aspect of the contribution of the people that are around these resources in terms of management and conservation. So as such, the TFCA approach actually tries to address this whole issue about conflict between the communities and biodiversity. So conservation without people is just a conversation, as it were. So essentially, TFCA would achieve biodiversity conservation, but at the same time address developmental challenges in those remote areas within SADC, and that feeds into the whole SADC agenda about poverty alleviation and economic development. Can I have the next slide, please? Next slide. So essentially, the program itself, the vision is a model of community-centered, regionally integrated, and sustainably managed network of world-class transfrontier conservation areas. The mission is for SADC to become a functional and integrated network of transfrontier conservation areas where shared natural resources across the boundaries are sustainably co-managed between the different member states and also conserved to foster economic development for the region, and also will encourage regional integration for the benefit of those living within and around these resources. At the same time, I think it is also critical that we think about handing over to future generations, which is very typical of any kind of conservation program. Next slide, please. So essentially, key components, my colleague talked about the fourth component, which is the one that brings that together today. The fourth component, I will not emphasize much on that, but the first component looks at the advocacy and harmonization, especially harmonization of the different management system, legislations across the different boundaries so that they become compatible and operate as one unit as single units, as it were, single management units. The advocacy component becomes very critical because it's a new conservation approach that we have introduced in the region. So it's very critical that people, policymakers, and so forth also come on board in terms of how we want to approach this. But it is also important that we mobilize resources for the management of these TFCAs. So enhancement of these financing mechanisms is very important for us. Capacity building, we are working with a number of our institutions. Some we identified as centers of excellence in terms of training wildlife. I'll show you some examples as we go along. And we're also working on trying to make sure that local people, by all means, participate in terms of addressing some of their needs, especially looking at their livelihoods. But we also see that climate change is a major global challenge that we face. And we also believe that TFCAs would actually make a huge contribution in terms of addressing this aspect of climate change. But above all, we believe our TFCAs present a big opportunity in terms of tourism, which is a low-hanging fruit in the region in general, like my colleague has indicated. Can I get to the next slide, please? I'll quickly go through this one. This slide talks about some of the major tangible results that we see on the ground at the moment. And to begin with, TFCAs have been formalized in terms of the SADC policies that my colleague indicated from the treaty itself and the different protocols. But also, we see that it looks at resources that support conservation in terms of the management actions and so forth. So we've managed to mobilize a lot of resources and partnerships that came to support conservation in the region. We've also seen expansion of the biodiversity conservation areas through new conservation areas. In some cases, there's also restoration of the ecosystems, particularly, for example, in the Greater Limpopo Transfrontier conservation areas. There's been a lot of restocking that took place. And there was also change in land use. That saw the creation of the Limpopo National Park, for example. In Angola, within the Kaza or Kavango Zambezi Transfrontier Conservation Area, there's new conservation areas that have been identified. We've also seen more joint and effective management programs and activities across the borders. For example, between Malawi and Zambia, there's very effective joint law enforcement with support of partners like IFO and GIZ. They are actually operating a very effective law enforcement program that is assisting and also going beyond that and look at fire management and other management aspects, also including the engagement of local communities to participate in the management and also benefiting from these conservation areas. We've also seen an improvement in terms of tourism within the region, especially looking at improved access and joint marketing of TFCAs. As a region, I think we are better off to market ourselves as a bloc. Although initially in 2010 at the World Cup hosting in South Africa, an attempt was made to market the whole region during that time. And we created a brand called Boundless Southern Africa. And with that brand, has been given a mandate to actually market all the TFCAs in the region. So we think it's a big opportunity for us as a region. We also realize that through the contribution of the TFCA network that brings about information and knowledge sharing, we have seen a lot of platforms where information has been generated and shared, and as such, throughout this series of webinars, we are going to have a special session that talks about this information sharing and the role of the TFCA network and this contribution towards providing advisory services to the member states, but also generate data and share information. But still, through the efforts of the network itself, which comprise a network of experts that are working in the field, and some of the academia and practitioners, we have seen the development of so many guidelines. But of importance are some of the guidelines that member states can actually apply. And that talks to things like how do we establish our TFCAs, how do we engage communities in the TFCAs to make sure that they participate in the TFCAs. We also worked on guidelines on cross-border tourism product development across the different countries on the landscape. I think along the presentation, I'll show you some of the examples in terms of these products. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this graphic is just a presentation of some of these major achievements. As you can see from our top left-hand corner is the former president of South Africa and the former president of Botswana at the signing ceremony of the first formalized trans-frontier conservation area in Southern Africa, which is the Kgalagadi. The middle picture at the top is one of the cross-border tourism products called the Desert Nights between South Africa and Namibia. And on our far right is one of the forums where the TFCA network actually do some of the information sharing some progress, and also identifying areas of priority in terms of TFCA development. And then on our bottom left in the middle is just one of the demonstration of resource mobilization. It's the ambassador of Germany and the permanent secretary in the Ministry of Environment, Tourism and Natural Resources in Botswana, representing Kavango Zambezi trans-frontier conservation areas, signing for one of the phases. And then in the middle is just a show of the community, and then on the far right is some of the species that we are considering as priority in terms of conservation. At the bottom talks about the translocation and participation of communities in integrated resource planning for the TFCAs. Finally, I'll just go through some of the focus areas. Can I go to the next slide, please? I just want to wind up now because time is running out. The current priorities obviously look at our continued high-level political commitment that we demonstrated at presidential level, but also looking at some of the sustainability of the program itself. And this sustainability is supported by the contribution of the network, but we also value the contribution of the TFCAs in terms of general development of the region, which means we are also trying to promote biodiversity economy and so forth, so that we increase our GDP contribution. But it is important that we work on the monitoring and evaluation system to make sure that whatever TFCAs are contributing is actually measured. But in terms of resource mobilization, I think is very critical that we continue with that program that I demonstrated, so that we cover as much as possible more areas in terms of the TFCAs, and you will learn about the different categories and levels of development of the TFCAs. Capacity building is one of the key areas. Finally, I want to talk about what is our focus beyond 2020. My final slide. Yeah, focus beyond 2020. We believe that TFCAs can also be demonstrating the landscape approach conservation is more effective, also in terms of engaging communities, and so that they participate and they're empowered to benefit from resources. But in terms of implementing some of these multilateral environmental agreements, such as CITES, the CBD, CMS, and so forth, it is critical that TFCAs actually demonstrate and contribute towards some of the arguments that we advance at these conventions. But the importance of TFCAs is one of the key areas that we are going to move, especially looking at some of the challenges to do with the crime, climate change, zoonotic diseases. I think this COVID-19 is one of the things that we are looking at, but also to look at TFCAs as potential to attract investment in the region, especially ecotourism and biodiversity economy, like I indicated. But finally, I think TFCAs can also be catalysts for post-COVID green recovery and building resilient economies, I think, as part of this post-COVID. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you so much, and all the best with the other webinars. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Tawanda, for exciting presentation. In terms of the process that you're going to follow, I think we are going to invite all presenters to make the presentation, unless someone has got a very burning issue or issues of clarity that you need to raise following the presentation. We can look at those. But I would like to have all the presentations and then give an opportunity to raise questions and discussions, but also bearing in mind that sometimes time may not be on our side. I also welcome you to type some of the questions you might have or comments on the chat. That can help us even to address them even after the webinar. So while I'm going to invite the second presenter, Seth Mapalala, to give us the history of Transfrontier Conservation Area in Southern Africa. And please, if you have any burning question, you can raise your hand now. Alternatively, you can keep them until we finish the presentations or type them on the chat. We'll try as much as possible to address them. But let me welcome Seth to give the presentation. But by matter of introduction, Seth Mapalala is from the Kingdom of Eswatini. He has got more than 15 years of experience in biodiversity management, conservation, and planning. His current work involves applying the landscape approach in the conservation and management of natural resources in the Lubombo Transfrontier Conservation Area, which is a globally significant biodiversity hotspot straddling the three countries of South Africa, Eswatini, and Mozambique. Seth Mapalala has been a former chair of the SADC TFCA network when Eswatini was the chair of SADC in 2016-2017. So he has a lot of experience in terms of working the SADC TFCA network, and of course is one of the old members of the SADC TFCA network. Seth, you have the floor to give us a presentation on the history of TFCAs in the SADC region.
Good afternoon, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. And I realize that there's a bit of an overlap between my presentation and Tawanda's. So that means we'll shorten mine. I want to say it is a pleasure for me to just remind everybody the journey that we have taken over the last 20 years. But I've also taken the liberty of comparing what SADC has been doing with what the rest of the world has been doing. So when you look at can we go to the next slide, please? I think I shared there. Go to the next slide, please. Yes, the basic thought that we think about in terms of the transfrontier conservation areas is that area that is straddling across two borders or more. And our concentration would be with an emphasis on natural resources and cultural resources. Now, those cultural resources are unique to TFCAs, and especially for the SADC region. And this becomes one of the main thrusts that the SADC region brings onto the table in terms of conservation. Can we move on? Next slide, please. Now, just as a background to compare ourselves, previous slide, please. The move to have TFCAs or conservation areas across borders was initiated by Poland and Czechoslovakia in 1928. I think we've all been aware of the US-Canada Glacier Wanterton Transboundary Park of 1932. But it was very interesting to know that it was actually Poland and Czechoslovakia that initiated this, where they established about 3 parks all across the border and decided to co-manage them. And this was one of the initial moves to have 2 different countries who share an ecosystem to co-manage it. We also see the United Nations Charter that then laid the groundwork for cooperations for states to actually collaborate in the management of natural resources. And then in Europe as well, and created a Gran Paradiso, which was in Italy, and then because of the seasonal movement of game, then they decided to co-manage that landscape in which the game was moving. Closer home, can you go to the next slide, please? Closer home, from as early as the 1930s, Mozambique started negotiations with South Africa, especially around the area of Kruger National Park and the Limpopo, looking at the possibility of creating a cross-border conservation area. Of course, this didn't come through at the time, but the thought and the seed was planted at that time. And then we also saw support that came from the World Bank as early as the 90s, where World Bank initiated the involvement of communities in conservation. Because originally before this, conservation was purely the removal of communities and the putting up of a fence, even if it was going to be cross-border. So the element that World Bank put on the table was not just of trans-frontier conservation areas in the strict sense of parks, but put an element of community involvement. This is why from then, the thrust of TFCAs is uniquely involving communities as, and other people are also getting on board with the involvement of communities. And one of the other landmarks that happened in the Transfrontier Conservation Areas landscape is the creation of peace parks in 1997. Now, the founder of Peace Parks, Mr. Rupert, had been involved in the negotiations in Mozambique in the 90s, and saw the need to create an organization that will be focused on spearheading development of TFCAs and the funding, and can be able to fund these across the region. Now, SADC caught on then in '99 by creating the SADC Protocol on Wildlife Conservation and Law Enforcement. And this is the protocol that then defined what TFCAs would be. And the definition of SADC on the TFCA is, I think let's go to the next slide. The area or component of a large ecological region that straddles the boundaries of two or more countries, encompassing one or more protected areas, as well as multiple resource use areas. Now you'll realize that this definition is not just talking about conservation, but is also talking about multiple use, which originally had not been an acceptable idea in conservation areas. So now, because it's a divergence from there with the TFCA idea, the use of resources comes into play because there's communities around the area. Let's go to the next slide. Now, there are three key objectives that the TFCAs attempt to address. The first is the ecological objective, which is looking at the conservation aspect, looking at ecosystem services, looking at creating approaches that address management. The second objective is on socio-economic, which looks at the involvement of communities. These communities, some of them live inside the park, some of them live outside the park, but have an interest and they're affected, and therefore their livelihoods are related to the establishment of the park in this regard. And therefore the socio-economic development of these communities has an impact on the success of the conservation objectives or the ecological objectives. And then the other objective is the governance objective. As we are talking about different states here, most of the time they have different legal systems, they have different laws that govern their natural resources. So one of the things that then becomes necessary as an objective for TFCA is the harmonization of these, or the creating of tools that will facilitate the harmonization. Next slide, please. Okay. So the SADC TFCAs that have now been created include about 18 different TFCAs spread across the 15 SADC countries. And some of them are even involving countries that are outside the SADC region. And one of the things that we quickly realized as we started moving and developing the SADC TFCA program was that there's different levels that each of the TFCAs have gone through. But in general, we see 3 categories. The first one, which is category A, are those TFCAs that have legal instruments that facilitate the cooperation. And secondly, category B are those that have a simple MOU, which may be developed into a legal instrument. And then lastly, we have conceptual TFCAs. Next slide, please. Now, as a region, we've also developed several programs that are building on the TFCA goals. One of them is the SADC TFCA program, which Tawanda was presenting on. And this program has created a number of other activities like the TFCA network, which have enabled the sharing of information, the sharing of documents and practice, and the creation of a capacity building programs that will enable the sharing of good practices, where the SADC region can continue to be in the lead in the TFCA front. One of the other programs that we've also been able to create is the SADC tourism program. And this has a major focus on tourism. And those goals in the tourism program, I think some of them have been described in the first presentation. But one of the key aspects is the marketing of the TFCAs that we see today. One of the other aspects that we see that come with the marketing is the creation of Boundless Southern Africa, which is not just a marketing tool, but also facilitates tourism and the development of products in the region. And then also the creation of the SADC Transboundary Use and Protection of Natural Resources program, which has been funded by the GIZ as a partner. And this is one of the successful programs that SADC has had that have run for a number of years. And through this program, there's been a number of successes that have come. And it's one of those reasons why we always appreciate GIZ for the contribution in the region. Next slide, please. The priority areas of the SADC TFCA program in detail, I think I will skip this one because Tawanda made a good detail here. There are 7 of them, and each one has a sub that has been discussed in detail by Tawanda. Thank you. Next slide. Now, just to give you 2 slides of some of the milestones, SADC has been able to create the wildlife protocol, as I mentioned earlier, which laid the groundwork for the development of TFCAs. And then in 2013, we started the TFCA program. And then also in 2013, we started the TFCA network, which is an information sharing tool. The other aspect that the network has been able to facilitate is the development of a portal, which is an online platform where we can share information, we can have discussions, we can even have meetings. It's a very useful tool that has enabled us to be able to share easily a lot of information and find a lot of capacity that the region has. And then we've also been able to create structures for governance and created learning opportunities through the symposium that was done in 2016. And then create partnership as well with cooperating partners that have facilitated capacity building, infrastructure development, and technical support. And without these, the SADC TFCA program definitely would be several steps behind. So it is very appreciated that we've had a number of partners that have supported the SADC region. Next slide, please. We've also managed to create other collaborative structures as a region, and we've adopted things like the landscape approach to biodiversity conservation, which the world is now promoting because it moves from the piecemeal approach to the bigger picture approach. The development of critical infrastructure in the TFCAs. Many of the TFCAs, especially the first 8 that have legal instruments, have had a lot of infrastructure that enables tourism and other aspects of success for the tourism, for the TFCA, sorry. We've increased tourism arrivals. And in fact, the region has seen the growth of tourism even during the economic downturn of the last 8 years. And part of the contributors to this increased arrival has been the TFCA, which brings in the element of 2 countries or 3 countries experience with the same product. And this is one of the successes that the TFCA has been able to bring on the table for the region. And then we've also created the packaging of products so that it can be easier for tourists to be able to experience products that are shared. For example, the experience of the Zambezi between Zambia and Zimbabwe with the Univisa has enabled tourists who would otherwise have been stuck on the Zambian side to be able to experience the Zimbabwean side, and vice versa. So that means tourists will be able to spend more nights on a particular product because they don't have to be stuck on the same country. And this is what the TFCA has been able to provide. And we are hoping that this uni-visa is going to be expanded to the rest of the region and be one of our success stories. Next slide, please. Now, one of the interesting things that has happened as I conclude is that we've been able to, with the assistance of Boundless Southern Africa, be able to profile each TFCA on the offerings that it can be able to provide. And this has aided the development of innovative experiences. For example, the Desert Night product is a bike ride on a moonlight night, which is one of the unique experiences in a desert. And it cannot be found anywhere else except in our TFCAs in the region. And this is why the profiling would assist. And we hope that these products are going to proliferate throughout the region. And then we also would see a development of routines and itinerary or routes and itineraries throughout the region, because in 2010, when Kingsley Holgate traversed through the region, one of the things that he did was to lay groundwork for the opportunity to experience more than one country throughout the region, and therefore create or the possibilities of multi-country itineraries. And of course, this needs a collaboration of a lot of partners. We cannot do it without the collaboration of private sector, who fine-tune the products to market needs. We cannot do it without the funding from our international partners. We cannot do it without the involvement of the government that regulates and enables the operation of the TFCAs. And we cannot be able to do it without all the TFCA partners that have been able to do this. It is these partners that have enabled TFCAs to develop over the past 20 years. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth, for a very exciting presentation. And I'd like to quickly add something before I invite Dr. Soto to say that one of the key achievements that I think we need to also get you understand or hear about is that that we've had or gained in terms of implementing the Trans-Frontier Conservation Areas in 20 years. Recently, we were invited by the East African community, the TFCA network, to talk to them and share experiences on how to go about establishing and managing an effective transboundary conservation areas network. So we had a seminar on 26th of June, whereby we spoke to the East African community. They do have a transboundary conservation areas working group. So they listened to the TFCA network to try and learn as much as possible what are the experiences so that it can help them in their journey in establishing trans-frontier conservation areas in East Africa. So I think this is a very good recognition for Southern Africa that we need to be excited and proud of. So without further ado, I think I need to invite the last presenter for today, who is Dr. Soto from Mozambique. Dr. Soto is going to give us a presentation on building regional capacity to establish and manage TFCAs, a case study of Mozambique. By the way of introduction, Dr. Soto is one of the pioneers in development of TFCAs in the region. because he started working in the TFCA space in 1996 in Mozambique. Dr. Soto has worked in many capacities in terms of developing and managing TFCAs in the region. With SADC Secretariat, whereby he was a technical advisor for Transformation Government of Mozambique in various aspects. He has worked with the Peace Pax Foundation in Mozambique. He was a technical advisor in the ministry to the Minister of Environment of Angola in developing nature-based tourism, a plan for Angola. But currently he's a consultant to the World Bank in Mozambique, and he's supporting Division of Environment and Natural Resources, particularly supporting MOSBIO and MOS FIP projects. So Dr. Soto is going to give us a presentation on building regional capacity to establish TFCAs and focusing mainly on the case study of Mozambique, how Mozambique has benefited from transfrontier conservation areas. Dr. Soto, you have the floor.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very much the organizers for inviting me to share some of the ideas that I have in regard to building regional capacity to establish and manage TFCAs. TFCAs, as said by previous speakers, contribute to the protection of biodiversity and establishment of peaceful relations between neighboring countries and well-being of people living in and around protected environments. The overarching keystone to enable the establishment and management of TFCAs are those intangible aspects of capacity, such as social acceptance of conservation, political will, institutional cultures, relationship building, and cultural factors that support protection, management, motivation, and willingness to support conservation and sustainable development. Since I was asked to focus on a regional capacity to establish and manage TFCAs, I thought we could together revisit some concepts. The one could be of regional integration, the other one would be capacity of TFCAs. Regional integration is a process in which neighboring states enter into an agreement in order to upgrade cooperation through common institutions and rules. The objectives of the agreement could range from economic to political to environmental. Regional integration has been organized either via supranational institutional structure or through intergovernmental decision-making, or a combination of both. The World Bank Regional Integration Strategy for Africa 2018 and 2023 recognized that many of today's fragility risks in Africa have an increasing cross-border dimension. Cross-border fragility risks could take multiple forms: violent conflicts, forced displacement, spread of epidemics, or uncoordinated management of shared natural resources. Some of these risks have materialized in recent years. The conflict and unrest caused by Boko Haram in countries of West and Central Africa show that conflicts quickly spill over across the borders, pointing to the drivers of fragility having a cross-country dimension. These conflicts come to a tremendous economic, environmental, social, and human costs. With the aim of achieving economic unity, free trade, and movement of people and goods, as well as promoting sustainable development of the countries, there are in African continent 8 regional economic communities recognized by the African Union, each established under separate regional treaty. These are EMU, CENSAD, COMESA, EAC, ECAS, ECOWAS, ENGAD, and SADC. Specifically, the SADC objectives are to achieve economic development, peace and security, and growth, alleviate poverty, enhance the standards and quality of life of peoples of Southern Africa, and support the socially disadvantaged through regional integration. The SADC Protocol on Wildlife Management and Law Enforcement is the guiding framework for the establishment and management of TFCAs in the region. as it commits members to promote the conservation of shared wildlife resources through the establishment of transfrontier conservation areas. And the Transfrontier Conservation Program defined one of its components as dedicated to capacity building for TFCA stakeholders. In regard to regional capacity, I would like to share with you the definition of capacity, which refers to the ability of individuals, communities, institutions, organizations, social and political systems to use the natural, financial, political, social, and human resources that are available to them for the definition and pursuit of sustainable development goals. The biodiversity-related multilateral environmental agreements have stressed the significance of capacity building for the achieving their implementation. One of the strategic goals of the strategic plan of Convention on Biological Diversity focus on capacity, calling for parties to improve financial, human, scientific, technical, and technological capacity to implement the convention. Also, the ICN Strategic Framework for Capacity Development 2015-2020 defines 3 related priority focal groups for capacity development for the decade: protected area, institutions, and personnel. Those who have formal and legal responsibility for managing protected area. It comprises mainly official government bodies and their employees. The other one is the landscape and seascape stewards. This includes a wide range of non-governmental actors engaged in managing protected areas, but in which are unlikely to have been constituted for purpose of managing protected areas. And the third one are the influencers. These are all entities or groups whose policies, decisions, attitudes, political will, championing, and activities influence capital, capacity development, and management of protected area. So what are the existing capacity to establish and manage TFCAs? One of the greatest benefits of TFCA is the increase in capacity among respective national partner institutions to manage resources. Capacity building in less developed partners, nations, is also an area where donor organizations need to focus to create a long-term option for sustainable management. Considering the possibility that TFCA process often occur in areas that are remote and peripheral to the countries, the proponents and practitioners bring attention to the institutional capacity and development opportunities that may not have happened otherwise. In absence of such attention, the peripheral border areas are potential breeding grounds for social marginalized and discontent, within which unrest and instability could feast. At the beginning of the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park involving South Africa, Mozambique, and Zimbabwe, Mozambique had considerably less management capacity and financial resources than its transboundary neighbors. South Africa and Zimbabwe were regarded as the most advanced countries in Southern Africa in terms of parks and wildlife management. Kruger National Park is one of the largest parks of the region, with a highly capable technical team in the field operating with sufficient means. Gona Reserve Park has less capacity and fewer resources than Kruger, but Zimbabwe had highly successful community-based resources management, which is called Campfire Program. Local non-governmental organizations and private sector were very active in conservation practice within both South Africa and Zimbabwe. In Mozambique, however, the majority of non-governmental organizations were international and devoted to emergency actions and less to conservation. In addition, the Mozambican private sector was still relatively new and did not have experience in conservation-based business. Mozambique did not have a fully functional national system of protected area and was suffering from the lack of financial resources, professional capacity, institutional framework necessary to implement TFCAs, and necessary partnership with the private sector. Although the GLTP initiative greatly increased the complexity of the overall management context, Mozambique benefited significantly through the ability to develop a greater institution and local capacity. So what are those benefits that Mozambique had? When Mozambique enter into GLTP, defined two fundamental considerations. The one is the need to rural community to benefit from new economic activities associated with natural resource utilization. The second one, the need to for these resources to be managed on sustainable basis so as to safeguard biodiversity and maintain options for the future. To achieve the needs mentioned, Mozambique government faced the challenge of providing the required capacity for all role players, namely government institutions at their level, all levels, the private sector, non-governmental organizations, and local community. Mozambique created the TFCA program in 1996. For smooth implementation of the program, Mozambique established a dedicated TFCA unit in 1997, which had the resources, both technical and financial. Beside the fact that there were few qualified people in the country at all levels. The TFCA unit was forced to have an expatriate as a technical advisor to help the unit to perform. The Ministry of Agriculture responsible for leading the TFCA was extremely weak in terms of human resources to drive the sound conservation agenda for the country. There were only 5 staff members with a minimal level of BSc at headquarters in 1994. And there was nobody with that level at any park in the country. The parks of Limpopo, Banyene, and Zinav, which are part of the GLTP, had collectively only 40 game scouts. The Southern African Wildlife College, which is the only in Southern Africa that provides specific training in TFCA and located within the Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park, has been extensively used as a key education center to develop skills for Mozambicans and other nations. Since 1997, the college trained more than 30 graduates that are now taking management positions in Mozambique TFCAs. Remarkable progress will be witnessed as by 2020, the ANAC, the Mozambican body responsible for the administration of protected areas and wildlife, has more than 30 people with BSc, the basic university level at headquarters. And the Limpopo Park, which did not have staff at the beginning of the TFCA, has currently 317 staff members. 25 of them have BSc or more. Nevertheless, this is regarded as insufficient to face the challenge of development of the GLTP. Among the completion of resettlement for more than 1,000 families, stopping poaching of rhino and elephant, as well as to promote cross-border tourism. During this course, the private sector invested in conservancies within Mozambique component of the TFCA, which resulted in agreement between ANAC and the association, which is called Licoturismo. This agreement was signed in 2017. The agreement was to integrate the private sector as key stakeholders of the TFCA. This resulted in increased capacity to reduce poaching of rhino in Kruger National Parks. Incursions of poachers from Mozambique to Kruger National Park reduced from 68% to less than 28%. This meaning that from 2017, the majority of poachers in Kruger National Park were originated in South Africa and no longer from Mozambique. The World Bank is supporting a conservation leadership program, which is part of the MOSBU2 project. It is financing training to ANAC, conservation organization, including the private sector and local community, as well as students at level of MSc and PhD and internship, with the aim of increasing the cohort of skilled professionals in biodiversity conservation in the country. The program plans to have 445 beneficiaries by 2024. After all this discussion, I would like to conclude the following. Regional capacity to establish and manage TFCA is a complex endeavor. In fact, the existing regional capacity in all stakeholders is still not sufficient to efficiently manage Southern Africa TFCA. There's still difference among participating countries in terms of capacity, which will take efforts that must be coordinated at SADC Secretariat level to support the countries to achieve required capacity. Mozambique is a good example of a country that benefited significantly from TFCAs to shape its national system of conservation areas. The TFCA program that occurred from 1997 to 2013 has been key to achieve at the level of institutional strengthening a legal framework. In 2009, the government developed a policy of conservation and its strategy for implementation. This policy issued the principle of stakeholder participation in management of biodiversity, principle of public-private partnership. It determined the current structure of conservation system, namely the creation of the National Administration of Conservation Area, creation of Biofund, a non-profit company that is dedicated to finance conservation in Mozambique, and the option of pursuing co-management as a strategy to manage conservation area. Approval of biodiversity conservation law in 2014 that for the first time criminalized the illegal use of wildlife and established jail centers. This paved the way to strengthen the legal framework as a response to the increasing rhino poaching in GLTP. The TFCA program piloted a co-management of 3 conservation areas within the Lubombo and Limpopo TFCAs and facilitated the establishment of co-management in Gorongosa National Park, which is outside TFCAs. In regard to local community, it promoted the increase of implementation of CBNRM and were established mechanisms for community participation in management of the TFCAs. This was materialized by community participation in protected area management committees, which are defined in biodiversity law, the establishment of community legal entities, and community-based enterprise, mainly for tourism business. At protected areas levels, there was an increased attraction of co-managers to provide additional technical and financial capacity. For example, the Peace Park Foundation has expanded its focus from the establishment of TFCA to include co-management of protected areas within TFCAs to help them deliver. Limpopo, Banyin, and Zinaf parks are now part of the GLTP under the co-management with the Peace Park Foundation. Also, another conclusion is that initiatives such as the framework to develop a One Health approach led by AHEAD were also strengthened. TFCA also boosted knowledge and skill sharing, and the TFCA unit in Mozambique has been dismantled or weakened since 2013 as the donor funding was shifted to other priorities. World Bank, which was the main financing institution of TFCA, is now supporting MOSBio program, which is more directed to conservation area within the country rather than TFCA. In addition, the government of Mozambique has not been able to maintain the same dynamics that were given during the implementation of the TFCA program, which is threatening the continuation of the capacity building of this purpose. The government must take the lead and re-equip the TFCA unit. The next steps for Southern Africa region is that it needs to continue developing regional policies and regulations to face current problems and accelerate regional integration, taking into consideration situations such as COVID-19 pandemic as a threat to TFCAs. Due to this pandemic, due to the type of unexpected events, the scenario planning approach is recommended to be adopted as an important planning tool for TFCAs. Additional and diversified capacity to manage TFCA is required in terms of skills, equipment, and strategy, as we know that the COVID-19 and other pandemics are to come and stay part of our development. The SADC region must continue with reforms in tenures and the resource rights and the development of adaptive co-management arrangement between protected areas and neighboring areas and community, as it is crucial for sustainability of the TFCAs. The improvement of living conditions in TFCAs will require that local community are equipped with various skills and knowledge. These will range from understanding climate smart agriculture, sustainable tourism, biodiversity conservation, and cooperation across borders. For that effect, governments must continue supporting and strengthening the community participation and assessing benefits by improving design and employment opportunities and creation of jobs within TFCAs, including them in economic opportunity value chain, establishing community conservation area, local level land use planning, and promote the exchange and knowledge across the border. The region must also consider adopting leadership conservation training programs, such as the one that Mozambique is now implementing, to promote the new generation of TFCAs leaders that will be able to respond to the increased amount of challenge and ensure that TFCA is one of the strongest pillars to achieve SADC regional integration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soto, for a very exciting presentation. And this brings us to the end of the series of presentations that we have for today. We still have a few minutes whereby we can entertain a few questions and discussions. But I think what we have had today, we've heard about the history of Transfrontier Conservation Area in SADC, where we started and when we started. We've also heard about the status quo, meaning where we are in terms of the implementation, development and establishment of Transfrontier Conservation Areas. We've also heard about the post-2020 vision for Transfrontier Conservation Areas in the region, and also how TFCAs can serve as a catalyst for building capacity for improving the management effectiveness of protected areas or conservation areas, even at national level, using the TFCA platform. So these are the key presentations that we have we had for the day, which was shared by our experts that we have in this panel. So we are going to welcome to open the panel. We're going to open up for questions. So if you have any questions, please you can put them on the chat or raise your hand. So far, I've seen one question, which is coming from a gentleman. I hope I'll be able to get, I don't know if it's a gentleman or lady, Zeverino. I think the name is a bit complicated to me. He's from Kaza. He's directing the question to Mr. Tawanda Gotosa. His question is talking about concerns within the Kaza Transfrontier Conservation Areas. There is a high human footprint in terms of settlement in the Sebungwe region of Kaza TFCAs. So he's wondering if we have any funds or initiatives that can be directed to this area to address land use issues, planning particularly under the 2020 vision and beyond. Tawanda, can you please respond to that question?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Facilitator. Yeah, I attempted to answer that through the emails, but no, what I know for sure is that, yes, that Sebungwe region is a very high level conflict area in terms of interaction between humans and wildlife. And from my own experience, I think quite a lot is to do with the actual regional planning and also trying to attempt to deal with issues of human-wildlife conflict as I actually worked there. And I think in terms of some of the initiatives that are actually taking place there, there is under JEF 6, there is involvement of WWF in that area that to some extent is expected to address that. But I know it's a much broader and large scale problem. And I think under the global wildlife program under the JEF, Zimbabwe can actually submit a proposal to try and access such a facility. But I think, yeah, like you rightly say, it's quite a huge challenge, but to me, is to do with more of land use planning, human wildlife conflict, and also to try and mobilize more resources towards trying to assist all the law enforcement that is taking place around there. Because illegal offtake has been a huge area that I think is affecting that area. That's what I can say for now. But I think if we have some proposals on the ground, we'll be able to assist in linking you up with other initiatives and partnerships that are available within the CASA landscape itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Gotosa. I hope this has addressed the concern that Severino has. And maybe if not, we can continue engagement even offline for more information and guidance if required. I'm looking at the chat. I don't see any other questions coming. Colleagues, if you can also help me, Clara and Lisa, if you see anybody raising their hand.
Michael Murphy has a hand up.
Michael?
Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all the colleagues. Absolutely great to be on this call and to see so many friends and colleagues attending this. I think one of the things that has shown from our experience with TFCAs in Southern Africa, one of the critical issues is to make sure that we have, for these TFCAs, operational secretariats. The TFCA concept by itself is great, but if you don't have people to keep them running, to keep them moving along, the issues just seem to go round in circles, and it becomes difficult to address those critical problems. I think both in terms of CASA and GLTFCA, having a funded and operational secretariat has proven to be critically important to the implementation of TFCAs. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for that important contribution. I think this is one of the messages that we can take forward and consider. Of course, we have to discuss with member states. We understand, I think one of the challenges on establishing of the secretariats is the issue of funding. Most of the time you find that is a challenge because funding is limiting. But I think it's a very good advice, and we need to start looking at how we can engage along those lines and maybe try to raise resources to be able to support secretariats for a number of TFCAs, particularly the ones that are up and running and operational at the moment. So thank you so much for that contribution. Do we have any other requests for the floor or questions that we can see? My colleagues help me to see if I'm missing anything. I don't see anything on my side.
Yeah, sorry, I also wanted to add in, I think, to this important aspect that has been brought up by Michael regarding some of the coordination of activities on the ground, maybe through a formal structure like a secretariat. I think that is very critical, and I believe as part of the resource mobilization program that I highlighted in my presentation, those are some of the things that we need to put up certain mechanisms that make sure that we have functional structures that support the coordination. Also, this institutional memo continuity of programs becomes very, very important. And I think it's something that we really need to take seriously as a region. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you so much, Tawanda, for that addition. And we still have some few minutes. Maybe I can ask a few questions to, one question, but to all of the presenters. We have heard from them about the experiences they've had in transfrontier conservation areas, and they've been working on the TFCA for quite a number of years in the region. So what is the take-home message that they'd like to share with our colleagues who are attending this webinar so that they can be able to take home as far as the TFCA journey is concerned? Are there any key messages that maybe you could like to share, Dr. Soto, Seth, and Tawanda, briefly? I'll start with Seth.
Thank you. One of the key things that are becoming clear is that we are becoming a global community. And the issue of cross-border elements and products is going to be the biggest thing that's going to have happened to the rest of the world. And as SADC, we've had the opportunity to be ahead of the pack and develop systems and put in place legislation that favor that. Now, what we need to do to be able to move forward is the creation of a regional product that can be marketed as a region, that can be offered throughout the region, and that will have support, not just at a different country level, but also at a unit that can be a coordinator for this kind of thing. The reason I'm thinking in this way is because we do have an income of tourists into the SADC region, but we don't have a unified management approach to this group of tourists and to actually sell this as a block. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seth. And I think before other colleagues can chip in, let me quickly address the few questions that have come in the platform. There is a question that asks about acknowledging the work that has been done by the TFCA network, SADC TFCA network, and the fact that is being supported by the GIZ Transboundary Use and Protection of Natural Resources. The question is, are there any plans to ensure sustainability of the TFCA network beyond the GIZ support? Can anyone take up that question? Tawanda, maybe? I think you're better placed to respond to that.
Thank you very much, Madam Facilitator. Yeah, we have actually conducted a study to look at what are the options going ahead beyond the TUPNR project, which is the German-funded project. And we are looking at different options, including identifying other partners, and also to share some of the responsibilities as we move forward. So definitely we're also concerned in terms of making sure the coordination that I talked about actually of the activities of the network itself actually move on besides our German colleagues leaving us. But we are happy to say that at the moment, because of the amount of momentum that we've managed to gain, we still have quite a lot of partners that are willing to move with us going forward. But like you rightly say, maybe at some point, I think we want to believe we need to come up with a more sustainable program where we are less dependent on partnerships and making sure that the member states themselves actually get a more long-term program that will ensure this this momentum is maintained as we continue to support the program itself. But I also wanted to take this floor and maybe to share some of my ideas in terms of take home, is that I think as TFCAs approach to conservation have actually demonstrated, I think, in the region that they can actually work as a modern approach to conservation. So I think to us, our challenge is also to make sure that this is adopted by the policymakers so that whatever decisions are being made, especially with regards to regional development, actually consider that these development hubs in the remotest areas where communities actually coexist with wildlife, it's very critical that we actually prioritize in terms of what approaches are we looking at the development, so that we look at a more holistic approach and look at different sectors operating in harmony to contribute towards development of the region. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tawanda. And Dr. Soto, before I call you in, there is a question that is coming from East African community asked by Harry. And this question is about how did SADC TFCA learn from experiences in other areas, such as the International Gorilla Conservation Program between the DRC, Uganda, and Rwanda, or the Kalahari Hemsbok, which is Kalahari Transfrontier Park, before formal collaboration and their approaches. And the other question is, within the SADC TFCA approach, how much has been determined to be top-down approach or bottom-up approach? Is there anyone who is able to take these questions from the floor? My presenters?
Yeah, right. Oh, can I come in on that? Maybe my colleagues will also chip in to help
Yes.
me.
Yes.
With regards to these lessons learned, because of this facility of this vehicle of the TFCA network, we are able to share information in terms of some of the things that are working on the ground with the different parks or the different TFCAs. But as far as this the mountain gorilla example, I think is something that we are going to pursue going forward. I think my colleague talked about the dialogue between us and the East African community. I think that will present an opportunity for us to share some information and also to learn from each other so that we can apply to Southern Africa. That's what I can say for now. What was the other question? Sorry, I missed.
Is there how much is it top down or bottom up approach in the TFCAs?
Yeah, that one is a bit tricky. It also, I think the attempt TFCA approach is to look at both bottom up and down by all means, because of the widespread engagement and consultation that takes place with what we call the integrated development plans for each TFCAs. In terms of maybe as we go with the other webinars, we'll be talking about some of the genesis and development of the TFCAs. And one of the key documents in terms of guidelines looks at how do we develop the TFCAs, and this element of engagement at all levels becomes very critical in the development of what we call the integrated development plans. What plans do we need to focus on each TFCAs, and as such, maybe that would guide much better when we do the ITPs. But from experience, I think once there is an integrated development plan, development of the TFCA becomes much easier, and the consultations are clearly defined in the ITPs. Maybe my other colleagues can chip in. Thank you.
No.
If I can,
Yes, Dr.
I can add to
Yes.
the one that was mentioning in terms of that question, how much has been determined by a top-down approach and a bottom-up. Certainly by nature, TFCAs is about collaboration among countries. The last decades have been characterized by attempt to, let's say, democratize the use of natural resources, the access of natural resources, and also the process of decision-making from government to all civil society. And on civil society, the weakest are most of the time the local community, due to various reasons, their socioeconomic condition, a level of literacy and remoteness and so on. So that's where the challenge is. That challenge is even within the countries. I mentioned that Zimbabwe has a very successful program which is called Campfire, but it's still not at the point that we want in a way that community can participate. When you come into TFCA, then you're adding complexity because there are two countries, and the countries have got representatives, which are governments. So those are the ones who can commit what can happen in one country and another one. So these are the challenges that regional economic communities have to face now, and further develop policies that will bring a stronger seat for local community to discuss the issues of conservation across the border. Tawanda mentioned about the integrated development planning. Yes, that is a good step to start, but we all know what is this process of planning when it comes to crossing the border. You have to follow a lot of protocols, and most of the time communities are left behind. So the meetings to get the information, get the collaboration, we might not have a good representation of the community. And those are the challenges that we still have to face. And I would say that 20 years down the line, we only build a few blocks to have TFCA serving the local communities of the region, but we still have a long way to go, and we really have to target to that one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Soto. According to our program, I think we are now going beyond the time that we had allocated for this webinar. But in terms of winding up, there's one last question that I'd like maybe to quickly address before we close. Somebody, Precious Moyo Shoko, raised a question about, I think, which is linked mainly to the current situation of COVID-19. With COVID-19, we've seen that the international tourism has come to an halt. We don't have international tourists coming to our shores. And when you look at the TFCA tourism product, like any other tourism products in our region, they're kind of aimed at international travelers. So the question is, how do we intend to make to ensure that the TFCA tourism products are available and affordable to local tourists? I know it's a challenging question, but it's a real question because this is a situation we are facing at the moment. But if we can mention something around it, or we can address it later in other platforms. But that is the last question that I'd like us to address before we close the meeting. Anybody can assist us, at least even in sending. I know we might have not sat and discussed about it because it's an emerging issue, but any thoughts around it if we have the panelists?
Yeah, maybe I can chip in to begin with. I think we have one of the webinars coming. The one that is coming on Thursday is actually going to look at intensive discussion around the impact of COVID-19 on the TFCAs. And that can be an opportunity to actually have some intensive discussion around it. And the COVID issue is something that also caught a lot of us unawares. Just like in other sectors, we are still grappling. And so far, I think different member states within SADC have put in place certain measures. But fortunately, I think what is happening in some countries are opening up to domestic tourism to try and address some of these shortfalls in terms of the actual revenue that is actually used towards supporting conservation programs. But like you rightly say, something that is catching us unaware is something that we have to take on board right now. And if you remember at the end of my presentation, it's one of the issues that I point out that is part of the regreening of the globe. We really need to look at the impact of these zoonotic diseases on the economy, on the different economies at large, and especially the interaction between humans and wildlife species in terms of these economic diseases. Thank you. Maybe my colleagues can chip in.
Yeah. Okay. My addition would be for TFCAs. For TFCAs, the movement, because of the movement limitation, especially because of the closing of borders, some of the products, especially that are TFCA based, that have been offered have stopped. So many countries are looking at domestic tourism. So I'll make an example of what the Kingdom of Eswatini has done. There's been a drive on local social media of, first of all, attracting or posting on some of the places, some of which are on TFCAs, some of which are just local tourism products. Now, and then the second drive has been to reduce the pricing of these products, especially for the local market. So, and these two things have actually aided the visitation over the weekends, especially as the lockdowns have been eased, such that some of the establishments that are there on the TFCA have been reporting that the local market has actually been filling up their establishments. Now, I think the combination of the two has actually created success in terms of bridging that gap. Yes, the impact is still felt because the TFCA products depend on the tourists being able to cross the border, and that's part of the uniqueness of the product. But in the meantime, there's no crossing, and therefore the tourism is only going to be local. And therefore the issue of the pricing has to be addressed so that the locals can be able to come on board. The other small addition that I wanted to make was on the last question, to say the issue of community involvement has been lagging behind in conservation in general. So that's where TFCA started, where it was more conservation without the people, and then the focus then came on later on. And that's one of the critiques that has been given to TFCA, to say they have not necessarily involved the people. But what we have done in the Lubombo TFCA is to trial two things. The first one is a process that we call the participatory planning process, which is the eco-business planning process, which looks at building capacity for a community from day zero of involvement, so that by the time we get to planning, they've already been capacitated to the point where they can make sound decisions and they can participate meaningfully. And this has changed the game plan and the decisions that the communities are beginning to make. So we are looking forward to being able to extrapolate this to the rest of our TFCAs and enable the communities to participate fully. The second one is the creation of forum that can just involve the communities in the different countries in the TFCA. Now, this gives them the opportunity to share not just ideas, but also challenges that they're facing outside the control of your government officials or people that are felt as regulators. So this gives them the opportunity to decide what to then take forward, what to then learn as lessons and things like that. So the combination of these has actually improved community participation and enabled the Lubombo to actually lead in terms of community good decision making. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Tess, for additional elaboration. I think this has been very helpful. I think now we are running out of time. We've gone 15 minutes beyond the time that we had allocated for this webinar, and thank you so much for bearing with us. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, all of you, participating in this webinar. We have had a good number of people who attended. When I was looking at the participants, I saw ranging between 67 to 70 at any particular time, which is good. We thank you so much for your participation. I'd like to thank my panelists, my presenter, Mr. Tawanda Gotosa, Dr. Bartolomeo Soto, and Mr. Seth Mapalala for good presentation and for sharing your experiences in the TFCA conservation journey in Southern Africa. Thank you very much, all of you, for participating. And I'm handing over the floor to Clara for the parting words of any housekeeping announcement if she has before we check out of the meeting. Clara?
Thank you, Deborah. Thank you to Tawanda, Seth, and Soto for your time and for your excellent presentations today. Thank you for all the participants who have dedicated us all this time, and we're not in a rush to leave at the time of 16:30. So thank you for your interest. I just wanted to remind you that the series continue. On Thursdays at 1:30, we're going to have a session with experts in which we're going to talk specifically about the multiple impacts of COVID-19 on the development and management of SADC TFCAs. So we look forward to seeing you again on Thursday and then for all the weeks to come until the middle of September 2020. Thank you all and have a good evening or rest of the day, depending on where you are.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. This was very nice. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Bye.
Bye-bye.
So, lief toch?
Lief goed, oder?
Ja.
Save chat. Oh, hello. Ja.
Hello. Wait a second, let me. I wish I could speak German sometime.
We're still in, with people. Hi, all.
I know. We still have a lot of people that are trying to close down now. I'm gonna close the meeting now, and then we'll catch up on the other line. Okay.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.